Facepalm America, I'm Beowulf Rockland. FacepalmAmerica.com is where you can go to get more information on us. You can listen to past episodes. You can connect with us on social media, and I invite you to do so. So we are in a world right now where, as far as the left of politics in our country goes, we have more prominent figures, it seems to me, than we did a generation ago. It really is. When I first heard about Bernie Sanders in 2014 seriously being talked about as a possible presidential candidate, it was something of a revelation to me because I, as a C-SPAN nerd, had been aware of his presence for quite some time, but I had never thought that he would get to the point in mainstream U.S. politics where he was considered viable as a candidate. And so it kind of took me by surprise. And Bernie Sanders is far from the only one. As we know, there's Elizabeth Warren, there's AOC, there's the squad now. And I think it's good at this point, going into 2024, to have a conversation about the left movement in the Democratic Party in the United States. So our guest today is Joshua Green. He is a national correspondent for Bloomberg Businessweek, and he is the author of The Rebels, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the struggle for a new American politics. Joshua, welcome to Facepalm America. Thanks so much for being here.
It's great to be with you.
So let's start with Elizabeth Warren, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it kind of seems to me that I heard more about her in a national way even than I did before Bernie Sanders. Again, I was aware of who Bernie Sanders was, but in terms of like making waves and noise, it seems like she was there first. And again,
that's absolutely right. I mean, I've been a Washington political reporter for a long time, and back around the time of the financial crisis, which is really the sort of
right.
Original event in my book, I was a columnist for the Boston Globe, and Elizabeth Warren, of course, was from Harvard, and the thing that made her famous in politics first, before she was a senator, before she was a presidential candidate, was that she was basically the cop policing the financial bailout after the 2008 election. Right. And what was so striking about her to me, and I kind of come out of the lefty policy magazine world, was that, here was this, brilliant, smart, aggressive Democratic woman who was openly and publicly using her platform to criticize the crisis response from a Democratic president and from a Treasury Secretary like Tim Geithner and people like Larry Summers, who are very closely aligned with Wall Street. And it just struck me at the time, like, this is somebody I've got to get to know and write about, because I haven't seen this sort of thing in the past. And she seems like a pretty significant figure. And Warren, to her credit, turned out to be one, and really launched kind of what I submit in the book is the rise of this strain of left-wing populism that emerged after the financial crisis and produced, not just Warren, but, as you said, Bernie Sanders and later on AOC.
Is that really ground zero, essentially, the financial crisis of 2008? Because it seems like before that, people weren't even really talking about socialism in the way that we do today. Like, socialism was wholly constrained, and not just by the right, to conversations about the evil empire and such, as opposed to economic policy.
Exactly. To the history books, or the furthest fringes of, like, maybe your uncle's nephew or something like that was a socialist, right. But it was this exotic species that no one ever encountered,
right,
like in the wild. Yeah, I mean, to me, like, so I've been a political reporter in Washington for since like 2000. So my time here long kind of predated the crisis, and I came up through the American Prospect and the Washington Monthly, both like serious lefty policy journals, and the kind of economic populist ideas that these characters came to represent, like, just really weren't a part of the conversation in Washington. Like, a lot of the fights in the 2000s were about the Iraq War, and there were certainly good liberals and leftists, but it took the tremendous dislocation of the 2008 financial crisis, I think, to kind of jar people, including Democrats and liberals and progressives and socialists, into saying, what on earth is going wrong here? That like our party has elevated these Wall Street titans, not just to run, Republican administrations, but Democratic administrations too. And now the entire economy has kind of, collapsed, and it's impoverished like an entire generation of middle class Americans who are losing their jobs and their homes and their retirement accounts. And the response we have is to kind of bail out these big Wall Street banks, but beyond that, it's kind of austerity for a lot of middle class people. And as I'm sure you remember, it took 7 years after that crisis for America to recover the jobs that it had lost. And I submit in the book that it launched a populist revolution, not just on the left but on the right. The subject of my last book, Devil's Bargain, was about the rise of Donald Trump and Steve Bannon. And there's no way that Donald Trump could have wound up as president of the United States absent the financial crisis and the kind of weak response from the government that left so many people angry. And the story of the rebels is basically the story of the rise of the populist left after the financial crisis, which hasn't gotten nearly as much attention, but I think really should.
It's interesting to me that Bernie Sanders, of all people, should rise to prominence as a figure, as a part of this movement. While certainly you see, and this is it's an online meme, that he's been saying the same thing consistently as long as he's been in office, and that's a powerful appeal. I get that, but he's not exactly he's kind of a crusty old guy. He's not exactly the most charismatic figure in terms of what you consider a mainstream politician to be. Is it in spite of that or because of that he's risen to such prominence so quickly?
That is a great question, and I think that context is everything. Like, I was around Washington long enough. I knew Bernie Sanders a little bit before the 2008 financial crisis. And like, he was just considered to be this kind of oddball gadfly who, as you said, always said the same thing. A lot of times he'd be like the only vote, known as a purist, not particularly well liked by his Democratic colleagues because he wouldn't kind of go along to get along. But what happened was, I think after the financial crisis, you see the rise of this kind of populism. Warren was its first hero. But the story I tell in the book is kind of her rise and the rise of this Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party. There were two separate draft movements to try and get her to run for president against Hillary Clinton in 2016. But when Warren spurned that movement, she wound up handing the baton to Bernie Sanders. And I think in the context of 2016, we're now 7 years after the crisis, 7 years of austerity and middle class struggles, especially for young people. And at the same time, you have this kind of newly awakened progressive left that's rallied around Elizabeth Warren. A lot of the people in the draft Warren movement just basically switched jerseys and said, all right, well, she's not going to run. This Bernie Sanders guy is great. And, I think the fact of Bernie's curmudgeonliness and the fact that he kind of, he had this kind of rumpled authenticity that you'd say to yourself, well, you know what? Like, this guy is not trying to spin me like those slick politicians. Just look at him. But also, he's been saying the same things. And, those things make a lot more sense now in 2015 and 2016 about Wall Street, about the need for the party to raise up the working class rather than, do giveaways to banks. That struck a chord with a lot of people beyond what anyone, beginning with myself, could have imagined. And I remember being out on the trail with Bernie, and literally every day in the beginning, you would go to a rally and it would be bigger than the last one and bigger than the last one. And all his advanced people would be like, oh, remember that rally we're going to have at the Union Hall? We've actually moved it to like an indoor stadium because there are so many people responding to this message. And, Bernie, if nothing else, proved that the left populist wing of the Democratic Party was going to be a powerhouse going forward. He won 23 states, raised more money than Hillary Clinton did. And I argue in the book, it's just had a profound effect on Democratic politics that has helped shape the presidency of Joe Biden.
So I'm curious, what did you observe in 2016 through, the campaign and the contest between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, how that battle turned out, and then the fact that Hillary Clinton lost the election to Donald Trump? What changed in the Democratic Party and especially on the left in terms of attitudes after that took place?
What changed was that Democrats had not appreciated until Hillary Clinton lost that the middle class was angry. They wanted politicians who represented their interests. And if they didn't get it from the Democrats, then damn it, they were going to vote for Donald Trump and put him in the White House, which was inconceivable until the night of the election when Trump walked onto the stage. I will make a confession. I fully inconceivable to me, too, who covered the entire Trump campaign and like knew Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders well. I had pre-written a Business Week cover story about Hillary Clinton winning. That's how sure we were that she was going to win. And it wound up tearing that up, throwing it in the trash. The difference is people realized after that, oh my gosh, like there is something to this notion that, you know, these populist concerns are ones that Democrats have to address, or else people are going to turn to a right-wing brand of populism.
Right.
And I think very much to Biden's credit, I mean, you saw these ideas like evolve. And my book is really bookended by two financial crises. Like we've talked about the start, the great financial crisis, but of course in 2020, there was a bookend crisis, the COVID crash. And the response to that, I think, illustrates what a profound effect that Warren, Sanders, and AOC have had, because, you know, in distinction to the earlier response, first Donald Trump, but really Joe Biden had this kind of robust middle class focused response that was not just stimulus, but beefed up unemployment benefits and eviction freezes and student debt relief and small business loans. Everything directed at the middle class. These were the sorts of things that Elizabeth Warren had been pushing the Obama administration to do in 2009 and didn't do. And now, you know, I think Democrats have gotten religion that you need to keep your eye on the well-being of the middle class and govern in a way that helps them. Because if you don't, you're not going to like the results, and you're not going to have any luck getting elected to the White House.
I'm curious, though, if Democrats really realized after 2016 that they had to respond to liberal populism, why then did they decide to essentially go for the most conservative candidate that they had?
Well, I think, you know, it's a great question. And part of the reporting for this book was in the summer and fall of 2019, I went out on the road. I knew I'd written one book about right-wing populism, and this cycle I was going to write about left-wing populism. Right. So I was out on the road with Elizabeth Warren at these campaign events. If you remember, in the fall of 2019, there was a brief period where she was not only leading in the polls of the Democratic primary, it completely shaped the race around populist ideas, economic ideas like the wealth tax and all these sorts of things. The billionaires had been kind of frightened out of the race initially, and she stumbled a bit on the Native American stuff. But when she did, you know, the candidate that rose up and won the first primary, came close to, was Bernie Sanders. I mean, he was the guy that looked like he was kind of going to cruise. So these ideas, I think these populist ideas, have a lot of appeal to voters in the abstract, not just Democrats either, independents and Republicans too. If you look at poll numbers and if you look at what happens when these things are like put on a state ballot initiative, including in red states, you know, raising the minimum wage, that sort of thing is very popular. But I think what happened was in the spring of 2020, as Democrats were looking in the mirror and asking themselves, do we really want to take the risk, as much as we like him, much as we love his policies, do we really want to take the risk of nominating Bernie Sanders and risk having him lose the White House to Donald Trump again? And I think Democrats collectively said, we can't take that risk. We need to find the safest pair of hands, the guy most likely to be able to pry Donald Trump out of the White House. And that guy was the centrist, white, bland, non-threatening Joe Biden, who had a little bit of a blue-collar background and really just didn't register as a threat to most Americans the way that, you know, a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren probably would to, you know, centrist or right-leaning voters who consider themselves radical. And as it turned out, I mean, Biden was just popular enough that, you know, he did win back the White House, but only by 44,000 votes. And so, you know, it's probably a good thing for Democrats from the progressive wing all the way to the centrist wing that Joe Biden was the nominee, because he got the job done in 2020. And the real interesting thing about his presidency has been that, you know, he's really governed, at least on economic matters, more like a Warren or a Sanders would have than anybody imagined. I'm old enough to have covered, Biden when he was considered the senator from corporate America, since Delaware is sort of, the home of corporate America.
The senator from MBNA, the credit card
Exactly,
company, right?
exactly. Yes. So the fact that he's sort of taken up these populist ideas, passing the massive stimulus and the entire Elizabeth Warren kind of panoply of middle class focused